This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsuhone, and it's Friday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. At least, that's what I normally do in this series. Sometimes I also like to take a look at some of the worst cards in the game's history, and that's what we're doing today, with a look at the worst mana rocks ever. A few years ago, I looked at the best mana rocks in the game, so it makes sense to also take a look at the worst ones. A mana rock is an artifact that produces mana. While there isn't an official definition of this term, I do think the general consensus is that a mana rock has to be an artifact that actually nets you mana and can produce mana more than once. So it isn't something that filters mana, like Arkham's Astrolabe, and because it needs to produce mana repeatedly, an artifact you sacrifice for mana also isn't a mana rock, and this excludes things like Lotus Petal. Mana rocks are often powerful because they allow you to accelerate your mana. However, there are definitely some bad ones out there that have been printed over Magic's almost 30 years of existence. Although it is worth keeping in mind that the cards on this list are generally better than most we see in worst videos, largely because the very definition of a mana rock means that it will generate at least some value, since they all net you mana. The cards are still bad for sure, but this is relative to other mana rocks. As is usually the case with this type of video, I don't use as much data as I do for best videos, though I do use some data to help me make my selections. A card can't be considered for a worst list if it has top 8'd an event, or if it's widely played in EDH. Ultimately, the cards that make the list and how they are ranked is based on my opinion. Before we dive into the video, I do want to say that if you enjoy my content and aren't already subscribed, consider subscribing. I've also recently set up a YouTube membership for the channel if you want to give me some extra support and get some cool perks, including a badge in the comment section and access to a Discord server. Just click the join button below this video. You can, of course, also support me on Patreon and Twitch. Alright, with all that out of the way, let's dive into the video. At number 10, I have Altar of the Lost. While it's played less in EDH than some of the cards that are higher up on this list, I decided it was the least bad of the 10 on this list because it probably has the most potential. It does have a lot of signs of being a bad mana rock, though. It enters tapped, it costs 3 mana, and it can only produce mana for something really specific. In this case, flashback spells, and yeah, that's pretty bad. But I could see a world where we end up with a critical mass of flashback cards, and thus Altar of the Lost is sometimes actually worth playing. After all, it can produce 2 mana at a time, which is a big deal for a mana rock that only costs 3. For now, it's definitely terrible, but maybe someday it can work its way off of this list. That's less likely for the cards in front of it. At number 9, it is Phyrexian Lens. Yeah, there's nothing terrible about this card, but mana rock power creep over the years has made it a lot less impressive. When we get manaliths and strictly better manaliths with regularity, and we do, there isn't much of a reason to pay life for mana of any color on a 3-mana mana rock. There are a few commanders and cards out there that like it when you pay life for things, and that's what keeps it from being higher on the list. There are a small number of decks where this has actual upside over manalith and the like, but there are still far more decks where it's just a strictly worse mana rock. At number 8, I have the Cameo Cycle from Odyssey. These are some more mana rocks for 3 that are utterly outclassed by something as simple as Manalith. And while power creep is definitely part of what makes a card like this and Phyrexian Lens bad, it isn't like anyone played them in competitive decks before stuff like Manalith got printed and outclassed them. So yeah, they might not look terrible, but they weren't good enough to see play in their respective constructed formats, not even block constructed, and I think that drives home how much the cameos and the lens deserve to be on this list. At number 7, it is Soul Grail, another mana rock with a mana value of 3 that taps for a single mana. In this case, you get to choose the color of mana it can produce when you play it. That flexibility can be nice, but generally, the cameos or manalith variants would do better for you because the ability to produce more than one type of mana is usually better than having to lock a mana rock in on a single type of mana. Again, maybe this doesn't look terrible, but nobody played it in block or standard, and it isn't played in EDH much either. At number 6, I have Charmed Pendant. I think this has a very cool design. Basically, you tap it, and it mills the top card of your library, and you add mana equal to the number of colored mana symbols in that card's casting cost. While the design is cool, I obviously don't think the card is very good overall. It is a mana rock that costs 4, and yes, sometimes it will give you a nice mana boost, but more often than not, it's going to give you 0 to 1 mana. Sure, you can build around it like crazy and manipulate the top of your library, but you still have hitting lands and getting 0 mana as a fairly common occurrence, and that is rough. It's nice that it also mills you, which some decks can take advantage of, but it is neither good enough at producing mana, nor milling you, that it is really something you need to run in your decks. At number 5, it is Mana Prism. This 3 mana artifact can tap to produce colorless mana, or it can also function as a mana filter. Again, like a lot of the cards we've seen so far, you don't look at this and immediately think it's terrible. After all, it produces mana, and it can even fix, even if filtering is pretty bad most of the time. But again, no one played it during the time it was legal in block or standard, and there's a reason for that. Mana rocks that cost 3 and only tap to produce a single mana have always been a bit underpowered compared to others around, and this one doesn't even do a great job of fixing your mana. Alright, so far the mana rocks we've looked at might be better defined as mediocre than terrible, but I think once you move into the top 4, what we're looking at is truly awful. At number 4, it is Warden of the Wall. This is another mana rock that I think actually has a neat design, but it's awful. It costs 3 and can tap to produce only colorless mana, and it enters the battlefield tapped, which is really brutal for any rock that costs 3. The upside it comes with is neat, since it becomes a creature with a somewhat relevant body on your opponent's turn, but that isn't enough upside to overcome how clunky this thing is, especially because you usually want to use your mana rocks to produce mana, so it won't often be an actual relevant creature on your opponent's turn most of the time anyway. It also makes it easier for your opponent to blow up, since their creature removal can hit it. Yeah, you just should never be playing this. Maybe, someday, Gargoyle Tribal will really be a thing, I guess, but even then, I don't think people will be trying hard to shove this into their decks. At number 3, I have the whole cycle of mana batteries. These were originally printed in Legends, so they've been around a pretty long time, and no one's ever wanted to play them anywhere. They all cost 4 to play and can tap for 1 mana of the color of the mana battery. That's just not good enough for a mana rock that costs this much. They do come with the potential to produce more mana, but you have to sink 2 mana at a time into them to put charge counters on them so they can produce that mana, and sure, you can find ways to add more counters to them, but that's a lot of work to make a card that's terrible, only a little less terrible. At number 2, I've got Ventafact Bottle. It's actually played the least in EDH of any card on this list, but I only think it's the second worst mana rock in the game. It is yet another one that costs 3, but this one can't produce mana right away. First, you have to sink a ton of mana into it to put charge counters on it, and you have to do it at sorcery speed. Then, during your pre-combat main phase, you remove all the charge counters from it, and add colorless to your mana pool for each counter that was removed. It does provide some pretty serious ramp if you have a ton of mana to put into it, and it can do it repeatedly, but if you have enough mana to sink into the bottle to make a ton of mana, you can probably just cast some awesome spell already. So yeah, this is a very clunky way to ramp your mana. This does have real potential to give you a lot of mana in some situations though, and for that reason I do think there's one mana rock that's even worse, and that is Diamond Kaleidoscope. It's sort of an even clunkier version of Warden of the Wall. It costs 4 and can't produce mana on its own at all. First, it has to make a 0/1 prism token for 3 mana, at which point you can then sacrifice that token for mana of any color. I know people like making tokens and ramping, but this is so bad at both that it still sees barely any play in EDH, and it shouldn't. An initial investment of 7 to get back that first mana is brutal, and you don't ever really feel like you're coming out ahead if you're using the Kaleidoscope. If you sink a ton of mana into this so it can set you up for a big turn, your opponent will just kill you. I think this is the worst mana rock ever. So, those are my picks for the 10 worst mana rocks ever printed. If you want to own any of these cards because, I don't know, maybe you don't like producing mana efficiently, you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each of them in the description. If you want to make sure you catch future episodes of this series, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the past videos in this series, including more on the worst cards ever, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that with a YouTube membership or via Patreon. Thanks for watching.